All right, here's chapter one on it's kind of a general chapter on science and biology or life. So we know biology is the scientific study of life. They ask all sorts of questions, and it can go beyond like how does a single cell develop into an organism or a tissue or an organ. There's so many questions that biologists ask, but they're all related to kind of life and living things, or life on this earth, life outside of this earth. One thing our textbook doesn't really do is actually give us a definition of life. So I really like this one, and it's at the bottom is life is the ability to self-replicate. Replication means to make copies of something. Photocopier makes replications of a piece of paper. But in order to self-replicate, you need your own materials and energy. All right. So when we have the ability to make copies of ourselves with our own materials and energy, we're considered living. And keep in mind, your cells will replicate. Some of them are replicating all the time. Your skin, your lining of your stomach and intestines, they're constantly, replacing themselves. They're constantly self-replicating. Some examples of something that might be lifelike that don't really fall underneath this example or this definition would be like a virus. Viruses are not considered living under this definition because viruses need to manipulate a cell's machinery in order to make copies. It can't make copies of itself. It actually needs something else's materials and energy. But this definition of life isn't very, it's not very descriptive. It just kind of draws a line and says, if you're on this side, you're living. If you're on the another side, you're not considered living. So listed here, and you see all the lovely pictures. These are some properties of living things. So living things are very ordered. They're very organized, and I'll get to that later, just all the different levels of organization, but just suffice it to say that living things are ordered. You can see this is a flower. You can see how there's many different parts, and each one kind of has its own little function. Living things are fit to their environment. Your textbook might say evolutionary adaptation. I like to say you're fit to the environment, which means many living things seem to function very well in the environments that you find them. For instance, this starfish here, seahorse here, it's camouflaged with the coral. You don't find it somewhere else. Kind of sticking out. It seems to blend in very well to its surroundings. So camouflage ends up being something that's kind of related really well to being fit to the environment. But, for instance, another example is polar bears. Polar bears are large, okay, and it helps them function very well in the Arctic because it helps them retain heat. One of the misconceptions about polar bears is that they have white skin, and they do not have white skin. They actually have black skin, and that allows them to absorb as much heat as they can get. And then they're also camouflaged with their translucent hair and so on. So organisms, living things, tend to fit in very well in their environments. So that's another property of them. Another one's called homeostasis or self-regulation. Here we have a jackrabbit, and jackrabbits, many of them can kind of live in hot areas, but they don't have sweat glands, so they needed some way to be able to vent the heat so they don't cook their brains. Well, if you see these large but very thin ears, it kind of acts as a radiator for the jackrabbit. The blood from their body, head, brain that goes into those ears and kind of vents into the environment, cools off the blood and then goes back into them. And they don't sweat, but that's how they kind of cool their body off. And that's allowing them to maintain a constant or semi-constant body temperature. But there's other examples, like, we regulate the amount of salt in our blood. We regulate even like the amount of like water and fluid in our blood. We regulate blood pH. We regulate our own body temperature through other manners other than what the jackrabbit does. So kind of maintaining a constant internal environment, that's or self-regulation, that's homeostasis. And reproduction, you might have learned about this in health class in middle school. You got adult giraffe, baby giraffe. Might be an adult giraffe somewhere else, but you get the idea. Living things reproduce or can reproduce. Response to the environment. Here we've got a Venus flytrap, and it's responded to the environment because this unwitting grasshopper walked into the Venus flytrap, and it has little hairs on the inside, and if something triggers one of those hairs, the flytrap closes, and it's hoping that an insect walked in there and it gets some food. I thought this was amazing growing up. We would buy Venus flytrap plants. We'd find them every probably 3 or 4 years somewhere. And every 3 or 4 years I killed it because it was fun to take a pen and stick it in there. And the flytrap would close, but flytrap's trying to get basically some protein that it can take and break it down into nitrogen and utilize it, because they live in very nitrogen poor environments. But anyway, and that's a long story, just to say that living things respond to the environment. If we were actually physically in class, I would probably throw a marker at somebody or toss one at somebody. And more often than not, they stick their hand up in the air and catch it. And that's responding to the environment. When you walk into a dark room, your pupils get really large. When you walk out of it into kind of a brighter area, your pupils and your eyes constrict. So these are just all examples of responding to the environment. Living things grow and develop. I mean, some things don't really do a lot of growth. But here's looks like we have an oak tree, acorn went in the ground, and baby oak tree sprouted out of there, started growing in numbers in cells. The cells started growing. And then, like, some of the tissues turned into leaf tissues. Some stayed as like a stem. Some turned into a root. These are all development activities where they're changing like type of tissue or organ. And then we have taking in materials and energy from the environment, or energy processing. Here we have a moth or a butterfly, and it's found some flowers that have nectar for it to drink. So it's drinking that nectar, bringing it into its body, and it's going to process that energy and those materials for later use to make more butterfly parts. Whoops. Okay, and just a side note, I think this is when we talk about living things and living systems, we have a lot of cases what we call emergent properties, where, the text here on the slide says it results from the arrangement and interaction of parts with the system. Yeah, that's true. But emergent properties really are properties that you really couldn't predict from like the sum of all the parts. So, for instance, we're living things. We're made out of water and carbon, oxygen, and so forth. If you were to kind of break down like all the parts that make us up on a really small level, you probably, like, looking at all this, you probably wouldn't say, you know what, I bet if we took all that carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen and kind of mushed it together, we would get like a person that's walking around. You might not, you might, you might predict something completely different. So that's kind of an emergent property, is where if you see the parts, when you kind of add them all up, that you wouldn't have been able to predict that just by looking at the individual parts if you were to kind of reduce everything down. And there's a couple different, approaches to study the living world, and I think I would argue, they're both very, they're equally valid. You've got a reductionist approach that kind of breaks down everything and looks at the individual parts of living systems. And then you've got kind of like a system, we call it more of a holistic kind of approach, where you're looking at systems and how the parts actually work together. So you can study those emergent properties. So reductionist versus holistic, both of them are equally valid, and allow us to kind of get a bigger and better picture of living world. Thanks.